Statement by Permanent Representative Vassily Nebenzia at UNSC briefing on the situation in Syria. Mr. President, we are grateful to Claudio Cordone, Tom Fletcher, and Vanessa Frazier for their briefings. The state of affairs in Syria is still determined by internal challenges and acute external factors. The unprovoked aggression of the United States and Israel against Iran and the subsequent regional explosion affected the Syrian people and the country's territory. It is important that the Syrians manage not to be drawn into a direct military confrontation and thus avoid numerous human losses. Nevertheless, the indirect, but at the same time long-term consequences of the arbitrariness of Washington and Jerusalem in the region will be felt by many Middle Eastern countries, including Syria. Thus, according to UN forecasts, there are high risks of an increase in the financial burden in Syria in connection with the mass return of refugees, hundreds of thousands of whom fled Lebanon against the backdrop of the atrocities of the Israeli army against the civilian population. Serious damage can also be caused to the energy security of the Syrian Arab Republic, including fuel shortages, as well as to the plans of the Syrian authorities to attract Arab investors for the post-conflict reconstruction of the country. Mr. President, we note that in the current turbulent regional conditions, the Syrian leadership continues its consistent course towards the unification of the country, including the reintegration of the Trans-Euphrates region, which has become isolated over the past years, not without the help of our Western colleagues. In this context, we welcome the recent establishment of government control in the northeast over a number of military facilities previously occupied by the United States, as well as the statement of the Syrian Foreign Ministry of April 16th on the completion of the withdrawal of the American contingent from the territory of the Arab Republic. On the whole, we are pleased to note that national institutions are being consistently restored in the east of the Euphrates, and regular dialogue is maintained between Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, on various aspects, including the transfer of full control over prisons in the northeast to the Interior Ministry and the Ministry of Justice, as well as the inclusion of Kurdish formations in the Syrian security forces. We hope for the continued uninterrupted implementation of the relevant January agreements between the central authorities and the SDF. Damascus's steps on the counter-terrorism track are still in demand, especially in the context of the fight against FTFs. We are convinced that building a unified political and administrative system of governance will contribute to the long-term stabilization of the situation in the country and meet the aspirations of the entire Syrian people. It is necessary to continue to encourage a genuinely inclusive intra-Syrian dialogue to promote a comprehensive political settlement in accordance with the principles laid down in Resolution 2254. In the context of strengthening intra-Syrian harmony, decisive steps are needed to prevent the recurrence of violence on ethnic and religious grounds. In this regard, we are alarmed by reports of an attack by armed gangs on Orthodox Christians in the city of Skalbia in the Hama province at the end of March. We express our sympathy to the victims and hope that those responsible for the pogroms will receive the punishment they deserve. Mr. President, the continued vulnerability of minorities in Syria will only play into the hands of Israel, which resorts to any pretexts, including the alleged protection of the Syrian Druze in its illegal activities. We consider the illegal activity of the Israelis, which undermines Syrian statehood, unacceptable and harmful. We reaffirm our commitment to the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity of Syria. We condemn the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights and adjacent areas, as well as the ongoing violations of the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement and the IDF's incursion into the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. We call on Zrab Jerusalem to abandon its use of force and listen to Damascus's signals about its readiness for a peaceful settlement. As far as we understand, the seriousness of these intentions has been confirmed by the public comments made by Syrian leader Ahmed al-Shara on the sidelines of the Antalya Diplomatic Forum. Mr. President, in a country that is already exhausted, any additional external pressure inevitably hits the most vulnerable, ordinary Syrians. The food security situation is particularly alarming. The ongoing drought threatens another failure of the agricultural season. At the same time, the spring floods affected tens of thousands of people. Houses were destroyed, fields were flooded, and sources of income were destroyed. Moreover, the streams of water washed away mines and other explosive objects. They now pose a serious threat to residential areas and farmland, making people's attempts to return to normal life a daily risk. For a country where a significant part of the population already lives below the poverty line, these are not just economic difficulties. This is a road to new threats to food security. Almost 7 million Syrians are at the level of a food crisis deficit. We would like to dwell separately on the situation of young Syrians. They are the ones who bear a disproportionate burden of the current shocks. The situation in the field of education is especially alarming. About a third of schools in Syria are not functioning. More than 2 million children have already dropped out of the educational process, and another million people are on the verge. Support for education must be an absolute priority, even in resource-constrained settings. Otherwise, Syria risks facing an entire lost generation, which will inevitably undermine the prospects for its recovery. Displacement remains highly volatile. The total number of internally displaced people remains almost 6 million. At the same time, a new worrying dynamic is emerging. Hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the violence in Lebanon are arriving in devastated areas of Syria in search of safety, where there is often no water, electricity, or basic infrastructure. This dramatically increases the burden on local systems and humanitarian organizations. In this regard, we draw attention to the initiatives being discussed in a number of European countries, including Germany, on the large-scale return of Syrian refugees. In the current conditions, any attempts at accelerated or forced repatriation create direct and serious humanitarian risks and can only aggravate the situation. Mr. President, Russia welcomes the launch in early April of the Humanitarian Response Plan for 2026, prepared by OSHA, in coordination with the Syrian authorities. The plan is focused on meeting the needs of the population and resuming the provision of basic services. It is important that the document directly acknowledges the obvious: there are not enough resources. Even with full mobilization, it will be possible to provide only a part of the financial assistance to those in need. Humanitarian aid cannot replace reconstruction. It is impossible to maintain people in survival mode indefinitely without creating conditions for their return to normal life. In this context, an important step is the preparation by the Syrian authorities of a national recovery plan, which is currently underway. We hope that the recent visit to Damascus by the heads of OSHA and UNDP will be the key to more coordinated work of UN agencies in the country in the future, in strict compliance with the relevant mandates. Russia is also ready to provide the necessary assistance to the Syrian people in the interests of long-term stabilization of the situation. Thank you for your attention.